Welcome to the first student presentation uh, for Mega's Fair State DAGD University. Um, or I should say the first student presentation through Mega at Fair State University's DAGD program. Um, Today I am going to be walking us through uh, some of the basics of Illustrator. I know a lot of people are pretty scared of Illustrator or they just don't understand why Illustrator is valuable or why you have to use it when you could just use tools like Photoshop. Um, and I would like to kind of demystify Illustrator for you today and show that it can be a really valuable tool for specific applications and also for to allow beginners to transfer hand-drawn images from your sketchbook into digital format without downloading additional tools like Lazy and Izumi that you might have to get on Photoshop, specifically when it comes to trying to create clean line work. And so, with that being said, why would you use Illustrator? What kind of applications is Illustrator valuable for? Illustrator is a vector drawing program. So everything that you see within Illustrator is made up of lines, essentially. These Bezier lines. You have two different kinds of lines. You have one that's defined by 2 points here. And then you have curves, which have these Bezier handles. And these curves are made up of infinite points. So they're infinitely divisible. So no matter how far you zoom in, they always maintain their shape. Now this is particularly valuable whenever you have artwork that needs to have extremely high resolution, such as print work here. So this is a poster that I made. Some of the graphics here are missing, or some of the fonts, but you can see here that no matter how far I zoom in on this title here, it never gets any smaller. And so when you're trying to print a high quality piece, the resolutions that are required are extremely high, much greater than your screen. And so exporting out those quality images requires a tool like Illustrator, where you can get SVG graphics. Another application that they're really useful for is stuff like logos. So this is a logo that I designed for a friend just on an afternoon. We primarily use the pen tool and the brush tool to do this. And it is infinitely scalable. You can see there's this much smaller version, this much larger version than I have here. He could size this to any size that he wanted to, and it would would look the same way that it looks right now. You would not have to worry about pixelation or any data loss with that. And those are the primary places that you would like to use it. I really like Illustrator. I like working in Illustrator. This is one of the personal pieces that I've been working on as of late. This artwork actually isn't my own. The original creator is Quinart. They have a lot of really, really cool pieces like this up on Instagram. And one of my favorite things to do in Illustrator is just to trace over artwork like this. This in particular, I was designing it as though it would be a t-shirt that I would wear. Because I think that this would be a really cool design to have on a t-shirt. And so just going through and playing with it. So everything inside of Illustrator is made up of these Bezier points, or I should say Bezier curves or lines, which I see a lot of people come into Illustrator and they try to use the brush tool here and they brush something out, and then they go over to the eraser tool here. Let's go pump up the. Oh, another thing you guys should know. For the purposes of this, I'm going to be working inside of the Essentials Classic workspace. You see there Windows, Workspace, Essentials, Essentials Classic. That's because this is the workspace that I'm used to. I'm used to docking things here. Adobe recently updated the UI so that you just have this properties section now, which is essentially this section but with more options. I also like to have this here with different tools and panels that I can reference. So if I come here and I pump up the stroke on this, a lot of people will come in here with the eraser tool, they'll erase along there, and they don't understand why they didn't get a perfect line come off, right? So they don't understand why it didn't take a chunk out of that, because this isn't bitmap data. The way that Illustrator works is it interprets these lines that we give it, right? So right now I have a stroke here that's drawn with my brush tool. Okay, if I go File, I select this, I come out here and I expand the appearance, and then I erase it. Now I'm getting the result that I expect. So when you're working in Illustrator, it's good to think about the stuff that you're dealing with as shapes, that you're molding shapes. It's a lot closer to working in 3D software, or if you've ever done modeling in a CAD program, you're not sketching lines like you would with a pencil. You are creating shapes and shapes to replicate the forms that you would like to portray. The And a lot of people also get very scared by these curves, right? These Bezier curves. Like, how do I use them? They're really confusing. Bezier curves are actually very simple. If I pull up this thing from Khan Academy, they have great. This is from Pixar in a Box. They have a lot of really cool resources for creating artistic content in 2D and 3D. But they have a really cool breakdown of how this algorithm works. It's a smoothing algorithm. So essentially, it just splits and then averages, right? Splits and averages, splits and averages, splits and averages until you get a smooth result. And then you manipulate the curves that are created by these with these control points, right? So the actual creation of artwork with these points is something that you have to get used to. It's a little bit different, and to a lot of people, it's unintuitive. As a side note here, this is also how smoothing within 3D software works. So if I split an average, split an average, undivide, split average, split average, split average. So like your turbo smooths, they do the same thing, just in 3 dimensions instead of 2 dimensions. Now, the points in here are infinitely dividable, like I said. So they take up a lot of data. That's something that is important to realize. So the higher detail piece that you're working with, like if I took saw a black and white watercolor stroke and I use that to create a texture in here, that's going to take up a lot of data. It's going to take up a lot of space in memory, and it's going to slow down your program, but you can still use it. You can still get some really cool effects with it, and it'll still be infinitely scalable. When you get to that point, you might still get some weird artifacting, because when you're expanding up these shapes, depends on the detail of what you have or how you want that to come across. There are a number of different kinds of points that are in Illustrator. So there are corners like this with no smoothing data. There are Bezier points like these. So anytime you drag these handles off, I'm just clicking and dragging here in order to create these. So manipulate those as such. And then there are also broken Bezier points. I'm not sure if that's the exact technical term, but if I'm pressing Alt here, you can see this little plus sign comes up next to the direct select tool here. which you can find right here. This selects an object. This allows you to select components of an object or a group and manipulate them individually. The hotkeys for those are A to go to the direct select and V for the selection tool. So A direct select, V selection tool. I have those hotkeyed on my drawing tablet. So you'll see me jumping between those tools, also to the paintbrush tool and to the pen tool quite often. It's P for the paintbrush, B for the brush respectively. It's I really like working in Illustrator. I think they're great tools. So let's dig into it. Another quick thing to note before we really do dig in deep here is the layers panel. When you're working in Illustrator, when you have all these different shapes, it is really important to stay organized. I have, if I drop this down here, you can see how many different shapes make up this component piece here, right? These are relatively unsorted, and that's after merging everything in this artwork. You can see if I turn this on and turn this off, I merged essentially everything into one piece, and I still have all of these different components that are associated with it. If I come back here, you can see I have a group for my headphones. I have a group for the hair. I have a group for the face, right? Having the layers tool over here is extremely valuable because you can find everything that's in your scene. You can have direct access to it. You can select it, you can group it, you can manipulate it from your layers tool, but you have to stay organized in order to take advantage of that. Now, a lot of people like to look at this layers panel and think about it the same way that you would layers in Photoshop, right? Just essentially like different canvases that will display over one another. And in Illustrator, it's kind of like that, but they're a lot more like groups. So whenever you create a new layer, you're essentially creating a new space to group objects within, group shapes within. You're not creating different layers for bitmap data as you would in Photoshop. It's a very subtle distinction, but it has a lot to do with the way you think about how you're working in Illustrator. So I wanted to point that out before we moved on here. So probably the most valuable tools within Illustrator are the pen tool and the brush tool, right? Most of the stuff that you're going to be doing, you're going to be using that for. But I'm going to go a different route for introducing you to stuff here because a lot of people get freaked out by the pen tool, and you don't have to be a master of the pen tool to get decent results with an Illustrator. You can get started with like image trace, you can start with the brush, and as long as you have a solid grasp of the brush and the pathfinder, and then you can come and clean up your results with the pen tool, it's very easy to get very good results in here. So let's take a look at image tracing here real quick. Let me just file place. A great way to get images into Illustrator, or the way that I typically do it, is just coming here to place. Control-Shift-P is the hotkey on Windows. My desktop here, my example, and pull in some different images and artwork that I have taken. These are taken on my smartphone. It has a pretty high resolution. I hold Shift here, right? And that keeps me from wiggling the images and stretching them out. So they will maintain their aspect ratios. I shrink them down so that they fit on my my artboard here, my canvas. Layers panel. Really want to see that one right now. I don't really want to see that one right now. So you can do some pretty cool stuff with Illustrator's image tracing stuff. And it also has kind of a rough time with different things. These are pretty high resolution images, so it's going to say object rationalize as well. Object. So I'm going to shrink them down. I'm going to shrink this one down specifically before we work on it. Otherwise, we're going to be here forever. Object rasterize. And then let's see this. Image trace. Oh, it's still a large image. Great. Well, we'll just proceed with it. So this is what the basic image tracing results will kick out. It typically, by default, it works in black and white. It doesn't recognize color, and it will kick out some stuff, something that looks like this for you. You can improve these results by coming into Photoshop and adjusting the settings on your stuff. So if I go here, open with Photoshop. I come in here, I can adjust the brightness and contrast might help with a colored image. In this case, I'm gonna make the blacks blacker, make the brights brighter. Increasing essentially the differential between those two items will make it easier for Illustrator to recognize that and draw the line there. Now, no, I do not want to save changes, and I shouldn't need Photoshop again for a minute. In order to keep these changes, you have to come up here and hit expand, right? Otherwise, Illustrator will get angry at you because you'll be trying to edit, or it just won't work. I shouldn't say it'll get angry at you. I just can't edit anything that's in here. I'm not going to hit expand for this right now because I'm going to show you that there are a number of different presets essentially that they have built into the image tracing feature for you. So I could come down here, I could hit line art, and that might give me a better result than just the default image trace. In this case, I definitely think that that looks nasty as heck, and I do not want to keep it. So I'm gonna hit Control Z there. Not gonna expand it. But if you want more control over what the image tracing is going to give you, you can actually come over here to Window, and let's see if we can find it here, and hit the image trace. And this is essentially what these are different presets. They're turning the different knobs and bells and whistles that you can get access to via the image trace panel here. So if I drop down to advanced, there's paths, corners, noise, the method that it uses, if I wanted to create fills or strokes, snap curves to lines, and ignore white. And you can use these different things to get better results for the specific case that you're looking for. Especially for things that Illustrator has a difficult time with, right? Like if I wanted to vectorize, say, handwriting, Illustrator would have a really rough time with that. Or if I had a highly detailed, like hand-drawn map that I had done for something like, say, D&D. I have a friend who had trouble trying to vectorize stuff like that he had drawn. You come in here and you have direct access to the parameters that are used in order to vectorize your image. So let's hit preview here so we can see the changes that we're making. Typically, for something like this, I don't like snap lines to curves because that flattens out stuff in the image, and I don't want that. Less corners, less paths for this case because I want a smoother result for my line work. I don't want to have to come in and edit and remove, and I want to have to do as little adjustment as possible after I bring this in here. And we can decrease the threshold here a little bit. This is essentially going to trace more or less of the image in your thing. You can see if I increase the threshold here, it starts to look at that shadow that I had cast on the page with my hand. It starts to trace that. It starts to grab my pencil lines. I don't want that. I want just the Sharpie lines that I put on the page. I would like it to grab as much of them as possible. So let's say I'm happy with this result. Hit expand. We'll dock this over here next to libraries. So I'll have it for later. And yeah, now I have a group. So if I come over here to my selection tool, you can see that in my selection tool, you can see that it has created a one object out of the image tracing results. I can come over here to library, to the layers, and I can see that underneath that group, everything that all the little bits and pieces that were traced out here. I can come in here, and if I want to have easier access to those things, I can hit ungroup. Now it's pretty likely that it's going to make shapes of everything. So even the negative space on the page, that is a shape that I can drag off here, right? You can see that there. Entered isolation mode there. You can see that literally everything in the image is traced. So not just the blacks and exist within there. And you can trace other images too. So if I come in here and look at this piece of artwork that I made a few years ago, a little painting here, and I select it. For this one, I would recommend a high fidelity photo because this is a 4K photograph of something with a lot of color. So I'll let this trace for a second. Probably going to take a decent chunk of time for this. And the main purpose of this tutorial is to introduce you to the tools that you can use. Um, I'm probably not going to get super nitty gritty down into the functions of each individual knob that you can turn and each individual way that you can edit. I'm going to show you where the stuff exists and some of the stuff that I think is important to know about that'll help you solve problems as you try to participate. You can see here that it looks almost no different at all. But as I zoom in here, you can see instead of getting pixelated, we have these different shapes that start to appear, right? So we don't get pixel. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that. So even though as I zoom in here, it's not losing quality per se, we're not getting a pixelation. We still have lower resolution shapes, right? You get to see the form of this specific piece of pink here that just kind of blends in when we zoom out to look at the image as a whole. And this image trace is typically what people go to first when they think about taking their artwork into Illustrator or copying stuff into Illustrator. I don't actually like image trace that much unless you have unless you have essentially a complete piece of artwork that you just want to like put up on a big banner, or you need essentially unless you're taking in a piece of artwork that you have already completed. If you are taking in rougher sketches or you want to finalize a piece of artwork in Illustrator, like I often do, then I don't really think the image trace is the right tool for that. All right, so if I just hit regular image traces, it's going to turn into a black and white image, but you can see what that looks like. All right, it's ugly as heck. We'll go high fidelity photo here. You can get some really interesting effects. Sometimes you can, if you want to do sort of like a portrait of somebody's face where you just highlight the shadow, or you want to create like a cell shade look to their face, something along those lines. You can start with image trace. That I've done that before. It gives you a decent starting place to edit the different paths that are generated, and it's just an interesting way to. It's an interesting way to. It's a decent workflow. So again, almost no change in the appearance from back here. But as we zoom in, you can see that we have these individual. Didn't expand it. These individual shapes that are defining the light and the shadow and the color within the scene. Right. This is a decent. If I hit Control Y here, it'll show you just the paths, right, that exist within that image. It's kind of crazy spaghetti monster that forms, Control Y again, this cloud here. Don't need that. So how do I typically bring artwork in from outside? What I like to do is I like to make a rough sketch, like I did with this little skull sketch here that I made. I like to trace over it using the brush tool. The brush tool in Photoshop is pretty cool. There's a lot of different stuff that you can do with it. It's a very diverse tool. Let's take a second to talk about this before we get into tracing the artwork here. I open the brushes panel here. I could also go to the brush tool and hit this drop down here. It's the same information, really. You can see they give you a few examples default with Illustrator. They give you like your 5-point round, your 15-point round, 3-point oval. These are different calligraphy brushes, I should say. Then this is one that I already have built in here, is a touch calligraphic brush that has some strokes set to white, black. Come on. Built in there, so you get those nice smooth curves. That's typically how I like to bring stuff in. But what I wanted to show you here is how ridiculously easy it is to come in here and create new brushes. So you can see that these two are faded out right now. They only show up if you have artwork selected. So let's make a new calligraphic brush to start here. See, they're pretty simple. Let's make this, call this oval, touch, let's do 1, 2, shoot. 1 to 7. Touch 1 to 7. So you can come in here. And so if you have like a brush that is tilt enabled, I could change the angle based on tilt, but I don't. So I'm gonna just say fixed, and I'm gonna adjust the angle like so. Same with roundness. You could do pressure, style. So there's a lot of different ways that you can have this, or a lot of different kinds of data that you can have it interpret here. So like I could change I could use the stylus wheel, also work with like your mouse wheel, so I could change the size or the roundness here. I'm gonna actually take this down. That's not the right angle that I want here. See, this arrow here is going to indicate the direction in which you're drawing. So it's always going to face like this, but as I draw, it will orient itself in a very interesting way. What I typically like to come in here and do is, a lot of times I'll stick with a round, sometimes I'll do oval if I want a particular effect on the image that I'm transferring or drawing. And I'll just come down here to pressure. And then you can change the amount of variation that you have within your brush. So I wanted like a 1 to 7, like a 1 to 8. So really what I should do here is go 4 and variation of 4 and a starting point of 5, which you can see here the range that it'll give me in the size. This will be a fairly blobby brush with dramatic transitions from highs to lows. You can create more specific brushes, more fine point brushes. You can make brushes for exactly what you need in your artwork, which I really like, and it's very easy to do that. This is going to be a 1 to 9. Okay. So you can see here, I have the brush that I want to use selected here. And so I can get these really fine stuff, and then I can get these a lot thicker lines. And all I'm doing is I have my tablet here, and I'm drawing with it. I have it set up so that it's just focused on the screen that we're viewing here. This is a 2-monitor computer. I have pressure set up on it. Let's see this brush. It's very thick, very blobby, very broad strokes. And another really cool feature that comes with the brush tool is I can come over here and double click, and it is automatically smoothing my brush strokes. So if I come down here and create a really accurate thing, it is going to pick up almost every different curve that I make, and honestly it'll give me a pretty ugly result. So when you're trying to copy or transfer artwork, oftentimes it's very advantageous to go slowly, and this is extremely helpful. So when you shake in your hand, that occurs. During that point, you can have it smoothed out, or if you need a more accurate brush stroke, you can transition between. Just for a point of reference, let's come back here, brush tool, and make it very smooth, all the way at the other end of the spectrum. Make a squiggly here. And you can see how it adjusted that squiggle to be much more elegant in comparison to this. However, this can be a problem when you're trying to replicate artwork, right? So I come in here and I get this curve exactly the way I want it. In this case, I got a pretty result. I would be happy with that. I think it's a very elegant curve. I think that captures the line in a very pleasant way. However, it can give you results that you didn't want because it oversimplifies or oversmooths it. The longer the line or the more sharp the curve, the bigger pain in the butt this can be. And also, the brush tool can give you some very finicky results when it comes to these sharper curves. Let's see if I can get it to do it here. From time to time, you'll see bubbles form in here, or weird splitting out there. Oftentimes, when that happens, I just like to lock this so I can't accidentally scooch it. Bubbles that can form, and when that happens, you just have to draw the line in a different way. Or sometimes you can adjust things with the pen tool or the direct select tool in order to get them to look the way that you want to. So let's talk about some of the other types of brushes here real quick. Let's see. Use this one here. This is a pretty good example of what you can get with an art brush. So you can see here, I double clicked on this to bring up the options, that I'm going to enable pressure for the width. Hit OK here. So what this is going to do is going to take that piece of artwork, this charcoal brush that they have vectorized here, and it is going to make my stroke. It is going to stretch that along the stroke that I create. So if we want to make, you can see you get some weird artifacting there. If I want to make my own, all I have to do is make my own shape in here that I want to turn into a brush stroke. So I'm going to use the pen tool here real quick to make this. Drag out some Bezier points. And let's make a nice kind of switch to the direct select tool to adjust, make sure everything's looking the way that I want it to. This will be a kind of a long, thin, and sharp shape that we will make here. If I was smart about it, I would have started with a circle, because that's the kind of end that I want here. But I didn't do that. I'm suffering the consequences. So I want to make this. When you're making these brush things, generally speaking, it's good to have uh, a black piece of artwork that you're starting with, because of the way that it handles coloring. However, there's always a reason to not do that. I'll make an art brush here, and I'll hit OK. And so you see that it's automatically made this for me. It's going to stretch. So if this is the direction along which I'm drawing, it is going to stretch from here to there. And the method of colorization, I'll do tints. So whatever fill or stroke I have selected up here, stroke in the case of the brush tool, I have selected up here, it will automatically tint that to look like the color that I have selected. I'm going to enable pressure on this. And I have some other options that I can do here. I can change how overlaps work. I can change how I want the flipping. I want to flip the artwork like along this axis, or I want to flip it like that. It's not actually complying here, but if I were to show you with this, it would flip it. I want it to stretch to fit the stroke length. I don't want it to scale proportionally. So you have different options here for how it affects the line that you're drawing. Let me just make a quick example here, and then we can look at how. Actually, what I'm going to do is scale this way down. For the effect that I want from this brush, I should have started with a much smaller. I don't want that on the. Just accidentally applied that to the stroke. I did not want to do that. Let's call it art brush too. That's fine. So you'll see now I get sort of long, tapering from this end to this end. A very sharp, kind of artistic curve. If I were to come up here and increase the stroke, I could then increase the thickness of that line. And this can be used to great effect to create some really, really cool pieces of artwork. Little ornamental structures or vines. It's kind of like a woman's hair here. It's really, really easy to do. So it's really easy to bang out some very interesting, very cool looking pieces using this technique. Now, if I wanted to create, say, a scatterbrush here, those are kind of different. Now, a thing to note with this is you'll see people do some really cool stuff with this, like create vines that then will stretch out along the art brush, or a lot of different stuff. It's really cool if you do any looking into it. So for the scatter brush here, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to Control Shift V to paste in place. I'm going to just make a little symbol here. Copy and Control Shift V again there to paste in place. Grabbing it and rotating it around, kind of letting the guides tell me where to stop here with the positioning of everything. Come on. You know I want you. We'll call that good. This like leaflet pattern here, I could add more detail. I could expand stuff around here, but I'm just gonna come here. I'm gonna group this. Then we'll go and we'll make a scatter brush. Okay. So actually, okay, so I'm gonna shrink this down. Shrinking it down, because these are vector pieces, shrinking it down, it's easier to blow stuff up on these brush tools than it is to expand it. Scatter brush, okay. Scatter brush one. I'm just gonna hit OK there really quick. And draw a line with it before I actually show you the different features, because it'll be a little bit easier to visualize the different effects that it has. So come out here and I'll just make a nice little curve. I can come up and I can make the stroke bigger on, make the stroke bigger on this to expand the size of the objects that are on the line. And then I can come back to the settings here and we can play with some of the different things. So I could make the size based on pressure. It didn't store any pressure data in that line, so this isn't going to make any difference here. You can change the spacing, so you can make this random, change the way that it variates. Oh, I want to preview this, that's right. If it did store pressure, no, it didn't. So a lot of times you can use these. So let's see if we can make a little sparkle effect with this. Do random on all of these. And we're going to change variation. So here we're creating sort of like a range in which we want these objects to vary. And then the spacing, a bit of variation there. And then we're gonna, for the sparkle effect, we'll drop this down. Have a lower amount of spacing, so more prominent. Honestly, having if you're familiar with creating brushes in Photoshop, it's very similar. There's some very similar features in here. Yeah, you don't have quite as much control as you do in a place like Photoshop, but it is, again, we're going to come down here to tint. I haven't ever tried to use tints and shades or hue shifts. This is the method that I'm most familiar with for the use of this thing. So now, light strokes. When I come in here, create these sparkles very easily. You can use this with flower designs or like leaves blowing in the wind to create some very cute little graphics quite quickly. So yeah. There are a couple other kinds of brushes here that we'll touch on briefly. Pattern brushes. They use the same principle as art brushes, where you can create artwork and then you can put them along different lines in a path. So I come in here and I make a geometric pattern here real quick. I'm using shift to keep these lines kind of straight. If you hold shift, well, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to do this, turn that into a corner. There. All right. So you can see here, I have this little piece. So come in, select this, brush, pattern brush, okay. Has this automatically set to like a corner, and I'll do auto beam. That seems fine. Do auto centered there. Um, I don't have a start tile or an end tile, so you could specify that if you wanted to, right? So that would be a special design when it started, a special design when it ended. So you can do some kind of cool stuff with this. Um, so if I make a drawing, you can see that it sort of bends with the lines that I'm creating here. So I could take this and apply it to, say, a classic example is to draw like a circle in the scene, and then apply the pattern brush to it. Right. So then now I had created this really rigid thing, but now I have this repeating, sort of repeating. It's not perfect. You can see that there are differentiations here, but for our purposes, it's pretty seamless, and the pattern repeats, and it's bending to conform to this pattern. Whereas if I took a line, uh, line there, pull this up again. And again, I can increase the stroke to make the pattern bigger. There's a lot of different things that you can do with these. And there are bristle brushes. I'm just gonna open up the one that they have here because bristle brushes they're try to replicate how a real brush behaves. Right? So if I do flat angle, okay. There are a bunch of different ways that you can vary the brushes. I haven't used them very much because I don't personally think that they fit very well with what Illustrator is good for. All right, and they also are a little bit buggy. You can see these little angulation there. Um, Essentially, they're creating a bunch of different brush strokes according to what kind of brush you're using and how it will behave in real life. There's a lot of math behind the scenes. I personally don't use this tool very often because I don't come to Illustrator to do that kind of bitmap artwork, even though it is capable of it. But it's very memory intensive. It's very awkward and clunky to do. It's just not what the program's good for, in my opinion. I'm sure there are people out there that are able to create some beautiful stuff with these brush tools. I just personally, especially for beginners, don't see it as nearly as valuable as the other tools that Illustrator provides. Let's come back here. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to edit this. And we're going to trace some artwork here for a little bit. Just, well, let's make a new one. Okay. Name our brush here. Let's make 4 points. Pressure, variation of 3. Pressure. Okay. There. See, this is a fairly consistent line. I think I still have my smoothing turned all the way up. Back to the middle. You can also change the threshold that it smooths within here. they give you pretty decent access to the what the default is. Decent access to the behind the scenes stuff in Illustrator, so you can get good results if you, with enough time and practice and research, trying to figure out what you're doing and what specifically you want to do within here. So let's trace that little skull image that I had. So make that visible over here in the layers panel. You have visibility and locking controls on literally every single object that will exist within your scene. It is very nice. It's one of my favorite features of Illustrator. To have that, it's just easy access, especially with the nature of the stuff that you're drawing in here. A lot of times you just don't want to select the stuff that exists there. So if I come here, just a little thick, so I'm gonna drop point size. That should be fine. All right. So I just like to come in here and trace the artwork that I made. It's a lot easier to ideate and get started on pencil and paper than it is in Illustrator, in my opinion. I find Illustrator to be a great tool, but I don't necessarily like sketching in Illustrator because compared to like a pen and paper or even like in Photoshop, it's very rigid. Um, like I said, one of my favorite tools to create in, but for like rough sketches, I don't really like it. I prefer more for finalized pieces. Um, People can create some really cool things in Illustrator, especially with stuff like the gradient mesh tool. I'll show you some examples of that later of pieces that people have done with it. I personally have had very limited experience with it, but I do know that it is extremely it's capable of creating some extremely high detail and photorealistic pieces with vectors, which is really cool. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just have Control Z rigged up to a hotkey. I'll just work it, see if I like the line. If I like the line, I'll keep it. If I don't, hit Control Z, just draw it again. It's very friendly way of working. You can see pretty quickly here, I'm starting to get my piece of artwork here realized. I really like to do this with storyboarding. So I'll storyboard rough concept sketches, and then make them a little bit more palatable in Illustrator. Um, Also, as somebody that doesn't have extremely or my 2D my two-dimensional art skills aren't very developed, and so it's nice to be able to come in after I've made a line and adjust it. I really like that uh, flexibility that you get here. I'm just coming in here with the direct select tool and adjusting this line here um, as I go. Just gonna pop it out here. Generally, within Illustrator, when you're looking at stuff like this, the fewer lines you have, the easier it is, or the smoother, better looking curve you're going to get, and the easier it is to adjust the artwork that you have. So, something to keep in mind when you see kinks in your brush strokes and you see stuff that doesn't quite look right. Oftentimes, one of the best things to do is just go in and remove some of the points that are making that object up. I'm going to lose some of the jagged uh, jaggedness that I put on these teeth here, which I could get back by having a more accurate brush stroke, or I could take my, I could create something like the charcoal brush where it would replicate the way that sorry, where it would have a more jagged or wiggly or rough object that was stretching out along the path. But generally speaking, Illustrator is a lot better at smooth curves, smooth objects, things like bubbly cartoon characters, um, that sort of thing are very easy to create with the tools that are provided here. You can see here in a matter of minutes, I've been able to take this artwork. Oh, dang it. Turn that off. I've been able to come in here and why are you still on? You don't want to. Okay. I make this artwork transferred in here into Illustrator. Now, if I had done this via image trace, I would have a lot more work to do. I would have a lot more work on my hands, a lot more adjusting, um, a lot more manual labor within Illustrator doing the nitty gritty stuff that I know a lot of people don't really like. Personally, I like fiddling with it, but a lot of people just kind of want it to look nice. This is possible. I wish I would have known how to do this a while ago because it makes it very easy to produce passable work. I'm not going to pretend like I'm the best artist in the planet Earth. As always with tracing something, you want to check what it looks like after the fact. And you can see it looks a little derpy. There are a couple curves here that we don't want. And this is where it comes to the second step that I would recommend is you use the direct select tool and the pen tool. Not going to be doing a ton of drawing with the pen tool in this case, but we will be manipulating these curves with the direct select tool to get them to look the way that we want as vectors. I'm just going to delete these lines here and and if I wanted to capture that shading, I'll probably do it with remove. So with the direct select tool, there are a bunch of really helpful tools up here. So I want to remove this point. I can come up here and hit remove selected point. Otherwise, I would have to come over to the pen tool and to the delete anchor tool, which is, you can see the hotkeys here for those. I do still have to do that if I wanted to add an anchor point, but it's not too much to ask. You can see these. So this is what I'm talking about when it comes to kinking, right? So you can see as it comes down here, you have a weird bend right there, you have a weird bend right there. I kind of want that here because that's how the skull kind of conforms around the back of the head. It looks pretty similar to that. It's a little too there. The arrow keys move things 1 pixel in any direction. That's a pixel in canvas space. So when I created this canvas, it was a certain amount of points by a certain amount of points. So whenever I hit the arrow key, it moves it one of those. And then if I hold shift while I'm hitting the arrow key, it moves it 10 pixels. So it makes it easy to move things with a decent amount of precision. If I think this leaf here is too thick, I'll come in here and use the direct selection tool for this. Reduce shape, and I'll just tweak things. until it looks good. It looks perfect, or whatever you're looking for from your piece. Probably not going to spend too long doing this, just showing kind of what the workflow looks like. Try to be quick and get things looking as accurate or as good as possible, as quickly as possible. That's typically what I do. Oftentimes I'll actually do this as I go. I think it saves a lot of time. So you're not coming back after you did a bunch of work drawing, if you have a larger piece, and having to worry about what everything looks like all over again. You just kind of adjust things as you go. Make sure your lines look nice. Make sure that you have that your points are doing what you want them to, and just yeah, generally just adjusting your piece. Move this whole leaf over so it looks like it's connecting a little bit better there. These teeth look rough, especially at the bottom of the skull. Yeah. So you can spend as much or as little time as you want doing this stuff. I like it because, like I said, it gives you a lot more control and precision over the artwork that you're creating. That's one of the reasons why it's so good for making things like logos. And there's just an element of repeatability and adjustability that I really value in it. I like tweaking artwork. I like tweaking things until it looks the way that I want it to look. And having that freedom to have it not look good and adjust it and sort of find what you want it to look like. That's a really big part of how I like to work. And so let's say that I was happy with this. I'm definitely now there's a lot of different aspects about this that I think should be adjusted, that I would like to adjust, or sort of perfect. But you know, I don't want to make you watch me do that for to my heart's content. If you see if I the next step in this process is to expand all this. So to understand why we do that, if I scale this down here, you'll see that it looks really ugly and blobby because the stroke on the lines that I've painted via the paintbrush doesn't scale. So the stroke on here is still 1 point thick, even though I've scaled it. Still maintains that thickness, even though I scaled it down. Same thing if I scale it way up. Those lines get really thin and start to make the piece look unattractive or just not what you intended it to be. All right. We come back here to the original. What you want to do at this point is to expand to appearance. There are two different. So remember when we expanded the picture, right? There are buttons under edit here for expanded appearance. Oh, it's under objects, my bad. So expand would apply to if I had a square and I wanted to, if I wanted access to the stroke of that square and I wanted that stroke to be its own object that I could edit, and I wanted the fill to be separate, I would hit expand. Expand appearance typically comes into play when you have a little bit more complex object. And it usually blocks one out and highlights the other. So I hit expand appearance here, and you'll see that when I shift this down, it stays the same as it was before. When I shift it up, it stays the same as it was before. What it's done is it has taken the outlines that it was using to display those lines, and it's given me access to all those points. So I can come in here and I can edit the individual lines and I can adjust a little bit more precisely how everything works. This is both another step in creating, adjusting your artwork to look like you want it to and have more access to to its appearance, to the form of the line, the shape that everything covers. And it's really It's a decent workflow to have this shape to rough everything out with your brush tool, get it pretty close, expand the appearance, and then finalize it. Because you already have your points there, you don't have to create them with a pen tool. Depending on the piece that you're working on, it can save you a little bit of time. Um, that is generally how I like to bring my art pieces of artwork in. Uh, we're at the point now where I would like to highlight the Pathfinder tool for you. So I see in places like here, where we have this weird bit of overlapping geometry, where we have this shape here that kind of like this shadow in the eye socket, um, that is made up of all these lines. You can see there's a lot of memory that we're wasting. It's a lot of it's a one large form that's made up of a bunch of different lines and different shapes. And generally, I find that to be quite obnoxious. So I come in here and select these lines. I don't want to select this one. Do I want to select this one? Try to find a bit of the edge there. No, I'll do it. It'll be fine. I'll actually make, if I do that, I'll make this whole arc here one shape. I'm going to come here to window again. I'm going to go down to Pathfinder. I'm going to dock this right here. Now under the Pathfinder window, you have some alignment tool options. These are great. These are wonderful. I would highly recommend familiarizing yourselves with these and the different options associated with them. I can run through them later. Then you have, under Pathfinder, you have shape modes, and you have pathfinders. Now, if you want to know more specifically about what these do, control. I've downloaded these cheat sheets from everytuesday.com. This is a woman who she's a professional graphic designer, and she does little cutesy tutorials about how to use, about different things that she's doing in Illustrator every Tuesday. This is one of her things from about a couple years ago, where she goes through and she explains in depth what every single one of these Illustrator paths do. She shows you how the outlines change, what the outcome is. So the most common ones that I'll use are unite and expand. Right, this is essentially a combine and subtract, and then you have your pathfinders as well. I recently used the symbols are a little bit different now than they are here. This was made on a different version of Illustrator, but the principle of what these things accomplish is still the same. This one I'll like to tell you real quick. Combines based on color here. So see how this square here is actually a separate object up until you hit this merge button, and because it is they're the same color, it unites. So you go to everytuesday.com. You can get these and download them for free, or you look up. Shoot, what is her name? Her YouTube channel is just Telia Cunningham. Here, I'll drag it over here real quick so you can see it. Or Teela Cunningham. Um, she does some really good work. Not necessarily in my style, but some good work. So I want to unite these pieces. So I want them to be one object. So I'm gonna come over here, click unite. You see it combines all of those paths. So it's a very easy way, using the brush tool, using expand appearance, and the Pathfinder's menu, to sort of create your objects, to combine them, and then using the direct select tool and the pen tool, I can come in here and put this to look nicer. So whenever you select something in Illustrator and you zoom in or out, the screen will automatically center. So I have a little point selected in there. When I zoom in and I zoom out, it centers on that. If I didn't have that selected, it just kind of it zooms in on whatever the screen's current center is. It can make it kind of frustrating sometimes to deal with stuff and make changes that you want to, but um, yeah, it is what it is. So that's the B. You'll see that as I'm coming in here, it's making things look a little gross, but it's very easy to just smooth that stuff out. For the form that we want to create, we really have way too many points in here. We don't need this level of fidelity for such a smooth geometry. So I can make this a corner here with this button. I can make this a Bezier here with this button. Just adjust this stuff down. I like to just slowly, methodically approach a final result that I'm happy with. It's nice just to put on some music, zone out, and make some nice looking artwork. And like I said, one of my favorite things to do in here is just to trace. Um, Whether it be existing artwork or a photorealistic image, um, just to come in, and it's a great way to sort of study form, to study line from other artists, or to say shape, not form. Um, it is, come on. I don't know why it always takes this smaller handle. I should take the bigger handle. Use that as the reference point. Yeah, but I've learned a lot just from tracing other people's artwork and thinking more deeply about how and why they constructed the forms that they did, because I'm trying to replicate them. Um, and if you don't like that Tim Keebler advice, I think that's his name, the guy who used to do those drawing adventure shows. He's a funny man. Um, Way back when. If you don't like his that style of thinking, then that's fine. I know a lot of people that think that tracing is tracing or drawing over other people's artwork is kind of BS um, from a learning perspective. Definitely is from like a copyright perspective, because people's artwork is their own. You know, they created it. They should get credit for it. I'm not really happy with this form because it doesn't really show that this is a shadow. It looks like this is one continuous piece of the leaf. It also kind of merges with the nose there in a really weird way that I'm not necessarily happy with. You can see that there's a gap that's clearly defined here. Then you just get rid of it there. But it gets the point across, right? I took that, it was a very blobby, sort of gross mess. And pretty quickly, I was able to adjust that to look very smooth curve. And yeah, it's the kind of thing that I do in here all the time. It's generally how my workflow goes. Um, the other workflow that I'll follow from time to time is the workflow that I use to create this piece. This piece was used just the pen tool. I did not start with the brush, primarily because I didn't have the brush tool when I was using that or creating this piece. But the piece actually benefited a lot from that fact, because it's a different way to create the lines and the forms that you're seeing here. So if I come in here, or if you just come back to did the same thing with this this here. You can see that I had the old image there underneath it, um, and I made this with the pen tool. So the nice thing about the pen tool is when you or the way I would say to recommend to I'm going to group this real quick so I don't lose track of it, and come over here to the layers tab. Oh, another really important thing to note about working in Illustrator is double click for isolation mode. Whenever you see this gray box up at the top here, and everything else in the image is grayed out, this is really easy to do on accident, especially as a beginner. And it's very confusing to get out of. You're like, what just happened? Because, like I was talking about earlier, all of the ways that things overlap in here and how you don't really have layers as much as you have like objects that also really exist in the same space. Uh, it is very easy to accidentally select something. So the way to avoid that is just double clicking on it. We'll bring you into this isolation mode. There'll be a breadcrumb trail here up at the top that shows you where you've come from, just how deep in it you are, and it makes it pretty easy to adjust just what you want to adjust pretty quickly. And to show you again what I'm talking about with the layer file here, now that I have two layers in this scene, let's just control copy, make a new layer here, control V, let's put that underneath this one. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, typically you have to operate on the layer that you are on. There's an auto select feature of like the selection tool in Photoshop that I usually turn off right away. But in Illustrator, you don't have that. Whenever you are on one layer, you can click on something else that's on another layer, unless the stuff is locked, right? So if you're used to operating specifically or exclusively on one layer, in Illustrator, it doesn't really work that way. Whatever layer you're on is the layer you're working in, right? Unless you lock something down, it's very easy to accidentally switch the layer that you're on and mess your organization up, or just lose track of where you are. Stuff's not where you thought it was or where you left it. It can end up being pretty messy. If you work in Illustrator for any amount of time, you probably know what I mean by that. Like control cut this here, click here, control V. Now this exists on this layer. I probably didn't want that on that layer. I was just navigating, or like you say, moving throughout the scene. But yeah, that's why I typically have everything locked that I'm not working on right now. I typically move object to object or site to site with the different layers that I have or the different groups that I have. And it makes life much more painless in Illustrator if you take full advantage of the layers panel and organize your stuff accordingly. Labeling is also pretty helpful because you can get pretty deep, and you can have groups within groups within groups. So another important thing to note is just coming in, left click, ungroup or group. Very important for keeping your stuff organized and succinct. So instead of coming into this layer and having group here, instead of coming into my my skull layer here and having all of this big mess of lines and not really knowing what anything is or where anything is, because it's all very abstract and very separate. Coming in here and grouping it. Don't lie to me. grouping it. I guess isolation mode there for the layer specifically. I was on an isolation mode for the skull layer. I guess it didn't like me trying to group that object. Um, but now when I come in here, I have a group that is this skull object. And if this was any more complex of a piece, I would have a special group for the flower. I have a group for like the nose, for the teeth, for the eye socket. So that when I want to come in and I want to edit something, when I notice something that I don't like about the teeth, I can come in and find where that is going to be located very easily and not affect anything else within the scene that I don't want to touch. So pull up. I usually like to try to keep all of my layers on, what did it is? Dang it. All of my images within one layer. So let's go to a different layer. That one's not being very friendly right now. Layer 4 here. And see how when I made that, oh, that's why. Duh. Let's fucking turn it off. Can't see anything on it. Why would I be able to select it? Delete that layer there. Holding shift to scale. I'm going to hide this specific piece of artwork. I don't want to work on that right now. I'm also going to hide the skull layer there. Delete this layer that I used for the example. I don't need that anymore. Title is flower. We're going to cover some super basics here of using the pen tool. Mostly just rules of thumb to get you started, because using Bezier curves can be very confusing and very difficult to get the hang of at first. One of the most useful things that anybody ever told me about working with vectors is that you cut, as a rule of thumb, you come about halfway along the line or the extent of the curve that you want to create here. You come about halfway through, then you make your handles, then you come about halfway, make your handles. So let's simplify this. Generally, about halfway, make your handles about as wide as the curve is, and just rinse and repeat. I'm gonna turn stroke off here real quick, because when you're tracing something, it's a pain in the butt. Have your stroke be. A useful thing to know is if you take your pen tool and you hover over a line that is incomplete, it will bring up the slash. That means you will continue that line. If you hover over a line segment, it will hold up a plus sign. And that means that you can add to that line. And if you are ever just kind of like doodling out like this and you're like, oh, this is done, I don't want to mess around with my line tool anymore, you hit escape in order to end that, right? So escape cuts that off. Because if I hit Control Z, right, it's just going to remove the last line that I created, and I'm still, the last point that I created, I'm still going to have that line attached to my handle, right? So I came about halfway through that curve there, and I made this point. This is a very sharp point, so I'm not going to drag after I click, because I want that to be sharp. I want that to be a corner, essentially. Halfway across this corner curve, I'm going to make a little line there, about halfway. The only real rule when it comes to this stuff is that you want to follow the line that you want to make, right? So in the end, the only thing that really matters, oh, also if you hover over a point that already exists, you'll get the subtract tool will automatically pop up. The only real rule is that as long as the curve looks accurate, it doesn't matter where your points are. So you just have to play with it at the end of the day. But when it comes to getting started, you going to about halfway along the extent of the curve is a very good rule of thumb. Most curves that you'll want to create using the pen tool will follow that. So you can see that I've outlined this there pretty quickly. If I was actually doing this piece, what I would do is I would do largely what the image tracing tool would do for me, but I would do it manually because I want to have much more control than the image tracing tool is going to give me over what the end result wants to look like. I want this form to be much simpler, whereas the image tracing tool is probably going to come in and create different stuff for all of this. And there's something very satisfying about getting towards the end of a piece like this, being able to look back and say, no, that you drew all of this, that yeah, that you made some pretty cool stuff. And that is about it when it comes to getting started with Illustrator. The Illustrator is an extremely powerful tool. I've been using it for about 6 years, and I've still barely scratched the surface of what it's capable of. This right here is the gradient mesh tool. So if I wanted to come in here, I can start adding different points along this mesh, and then what it will let me do is create lighting or gradient information on these points. I'm not going to get super into how to use that. If you want to know how to use that, I would look up a tutorial specifically on how to use the gradient mesh tool. Pull up some examples of things that people have created here real quick. Gradient mesh Illustrator. So pull this over here. You can see that like really cool examples are so the classic thing to make is an apple, right? You can see this apple is made using the gradient mesh tool. This rose is made using the gradient mesh tool. This is a really cool example of the gradient mesh tool. Whoever put my first try with the gradient mesh tool, I think that's absolute dog shit. But yeah, you can see how they define sort of like the facial features here. And so each of these are different colors that are placed on these the individual points. And then the way that the lines are created, the way the different colors exist within the gradient mesh creates the shadows effects that you see here. When you're using the gradient mesh tool, it's usually a good idea to work with something that has photorealistic lighting or have a lighting reference. Otherwise, it can get really weird or very difficult to get the effect, at least to know what effect you're trying to get with it. Sometimes you can make stuff like this. This is a little abstract piece that somebody made. It looks pretty cool. The a super useful thing to know about is the opacity masks, right? So if I hide this real quick, make this white, like a black. My text here. Good boy. I drag this over here. There's a couple different ways to make masks in Illustrator. One of the easiest ones is just to select the stuff that you have here. Go to, I think it's Object, Clipping Mask, and then hit Make. So this works with type. This works with different stuff. And then you can come in here. And a really nice thing about making masks this way is everything is very easy to edit. I can select the object that is masking this mask here, and position the. Don't lie to me. Okay, here in isolation mode, when I have it selected as a group, I can come in here and I can manipulate this mask so that it is showing me the entirety of the word mask, or the specific portions that I want to see, right? So it's a pretty cool way to make yourself a mask. Another way that you can do it is another shape here real quick in the opacity channel. So if I hit make mask here and then I come over here, it's important to note that this will essentially switch between canvases, right? So when I'm in here, I'm not going to affect anything over here. When I'm in here, I'm not going to be able to affect anything over here. This can be really disorientating if you forget that you are have this selected. As you come back here to layers panel, everything will be gone. You'll be like, I don't understand where my stuff is. Why can't I click on things? I'm confused. You just have to come over, boop, click over there. Super easy, super simple solution. A nice thing about this is that it creates a very self-contained object. So what it does here is it has anything that's white will allow other things to show through. You can create gradients. Anything that's gray will show like 50%. Vice versa. You can have a little bit more fidelity here. I used this at some point to create watercolor texture for some objects to make them look, to give them that like speckled effect. There's some pretty interesting results from that. Very like I mentioned earlier, very heavy on memory, very difficult to load, but pretty cool piece. All right, so you can see them swapping this around. Hit invert mask, right? It's not gonna show because it's fully white. If I come over to the gradient tool here, set the fill for this object is a gradient. It's black and white one. Gradient tool is pretty cool. Gives you a lot more control over the position of your gradient within the object. A very direct control, right? So you can see now that I have this white to black pattern that's existing. You can only really see that over here. Can't really see it in screen, but you can see the effect that is having the object behind it, where the black is fading, or where it's black, you can't see anything, and where it's white on this object, you can see the image. And if I hit invert, it inverts the way that the artwork that I have created masks. You can see that none of this black, right, is that surrounds the object is showing through, but it only affects the. You can also hit uncheck clip here, and then it won't do that anymore. Okay. So yeah, really interesting tool there. And then that's right, gotta go back up here. And then there's this. This is the color guide, or the color selection tools within Illustrator. This might look very confusing, but all it is you see these shades here. Those correspond with the vertical stripe in the middle, and this little arrow is pointing to. Then it gives you shades and tints. So it combines it with black over here and white over here. Come over here and you can show the options, right? So it can have more or less variation. You can increase the number of tints that you have, um, and adjust that to your heart's content. You can save this to your swatch panel. And now when I come down here to select colors, I scroll to the bottom, this is a new swatch panel for me. That is really awesome because it allows you to have self-contained color palettes very quickly. Um, and then there's this. This is really, really powerful. You're not going to really be able to understand it from this view, but you can have restrictive color palettes based on a whole variety of conditions that exist within this little panel here. So when I come over and I click this, this is the color, I think color rule editor is what it's called. But essentially, I can create my own color, yeah, color rules and adjustments here. I haven't figured out how to recreate this where they mirror each other, but because typically what ends up happening is they're locked in place. What happens when I rotate these? So if your base color here, it corresponds with your first highlighted color there. You can also manipulate this color, and it will adjust the other members of the rule accordingly. You can add and subtract different things here, and you can create whatever you want. You can create analogous, you can create color harmony or color harmony. You can create uh, things like Adobe Cooler, right? If you ever used that, they have different color rules that exist within there. Like mine is blanking. Like complementary colors, triad color group. You have the square color groups. You have like split, complementary. You have monochrome. There are a ton of different rules that you can take advantage of there. This lets you make that all for yourself within Illustrator. Export your color groups directly out, and they also have tools for recoloring in here, right? So if I want to switch from this swatch group to this swatch group for a specific piece of artwork, if I have, just to show you where it is, because to be completely honest with you, I've never had to take full advantage of it. I just know it exists. You can change how that stuff gets recolored when you switch between your different groups. All right. You can edit your rule here. And here is where this stuff really comes into play. So if, let's say I want my color palette I want to create a piece that looks like something from the Baroque period. I hit Baroque, and it now limits the colors that I can choose from to colors that are typical or traditionally found within the Baroque period. So I can come over and adjust these, like that yellow there, that's gray. I'm gonna slide this way on. You see this really cool looking little color palette here. Adjust everything according to my rule, but there's so much. I can have look like a beach, right? I can make myself corporate or earth tone. One of my favorites, metal here. So you have all these different things that adjust like reflectivity, and then you can change range or like how this I'm pretty sure is adjusting the saturation. You can see down there at the bottom, or in this case because it's HSB, how much black is being combined with the colors there. You can change the views, so you can invert it. Boop, 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 boop. For this one, you can make it so that you're selecting from like a more color wheel style looking thing. I can show and reorder the colors here. This is also very valuable for when you're trying to recolor stuff. You can change the different modes that it's displaying in, from RSB, CMYK, HSB. I said RSB, RGB, I should say. You can unlink the color rules, so you can move all this stuff around freely, and essentially define your color rule, then relink it, right? So that that stuff is where it is again. You move it in and out, and then you can also click on these individual color pickers and adjust their colors, right? So I can go in here and check from CMYK, or double click on it. Is it double click? Yeah, double click to your color picker, right now, for some reason it's set to color models. There we go. Or swatches to color modes, so I can get a much more specific result from that. It's going to adjust it to be within the range of the predefined color set that I have. But it's an extremely powerful way to create color palettes for your piece, or to recolor art that you've already created. Uh, I'm very disappointed I didn't know about this earlier in my career. I just found out about it while I was researching to double check that I had everything ready for this year lecture. Um, and then if you're familiar at all with symbols from anime, you have those in here too. You don't have as much of the animation functionality as you do with Animate, but if you want to have something, an object that exists across multiple pieces of work, you're going to have it repeated again and again and again, and you may have to go back and adjust what that symbol or what that object looks like later, and you don't want to have to go and redo everything all over again. Symbols are a great way to go. You just hit new symbol when you have something selected. Export type is a moving clip or graphic. You can't really take advantage of that within here, but if I were to export it for animate, I believe I could. So yeah, I have a symbol that is a black sphere. If I come in here, or I come in here, I should say. If I double click on the symbol, and I adjust it so that it looks like some sideways, terrifying smiley face object. And I come back here, you can see that both the symbols in my scene have updated to look exactly like that. Make sure I didn't miss anything here. Yeah, that is about it. That's all I have prepared for today. Yeah. If you ever have any questions, or see me around school, or you can email me. I'll probably have my contact information. If this video gets posted to YouTube, I'll try to link any relevant resources and have my contact information in the description so you can shoot me questions. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you learned something from it, and I hope this makes your time using Illustrator a little easier, a little easier to do. So, yeah. Good luck out there. Make some dope ass shit.